Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We are excited to have one of our development consultants with us, Ross Bottorff, and Ross is going to be presenting on how to create and use a Business Central API. And I know you're all eager to get started with this presentation, so before I pass it over to Ross to cover on this topic, I just want to remind you that we are recording this webinar as well as all of our webinars, and it will be posted in our on-demand webinar library for you to review again or share with anyone. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to type those into the questions box in the bottom right-hand corner of your webinar control panel, and we will get them answered during our Q&A time at the end of our session. So now I'm going to pass it on over to Ross to kick off our presentation.
Hello, everyone, and we will be talking about how to create a custom Business Central API today and how to use it. A little bit about myself. Been a Business Central developer since it was called Navision. I've been doing it since 2005. Started out at the customer level, then went on to the partner level shortly after that. Today we'll be covering the API, but I want to focus the attention on the development of the API and the usage of the API, but there is a bit of setup to get there. So you will need to know how to do an AL extension to create the API. And to use the API, some knowledge about HttpClients. You can use REST Sharp if you want to. You need to know how to set up users and their web service keys. We'll go over that a little bit. And if you're using on-premise, you want to know how to set up service tiers. I'll go over what you need to turn on the service tier, but we can't cover everything regarding setting up service tiers for your for on-premise. For OAuth 2, you will need to know how to manage app registrations. Again, I can't go over everything regarding Azure Active Directory today, but I can show you how to create your app registration. And mostly I'm gonna point you to some documentation. So, because I won't go too in depth on it, but you'll know how to do your app registration. And we won't go into how to manage users in the Azure tenant, like how to create the user. That's something your system admin would need to do. But I will be showing you which users are preferable in your tenants, especially if you're a partner, because that will come into play. Okay. So when you create an API in VS Code, you want to, let's say it's a custom API. So a custom API can be for a Microsoft standard API that you want to copy, something that has already been created by Microsoft, but you can't extend it because it's an object that it says you can't turn into an extension. So you have to create a brand new one. So that can be based on an existing table in Microsoft. You can copy the source code for the existing entity from Microsoft and rename it, give it a new ID, change some properties on it. Regardless, though, you'll need to do that in VS Code, and the table type is going to have a field type of a good field type, and you can name it ID. You can name it what you like. It's probably easiest if you name it ID. It could be system ID. It does not have to be the primary key. For instance, the customer table, the primary key is not the system ID, but Microsoft added one. The primary key, of course, would be the number field. And on the on-insert trigger of your table, you'll need to assign that API ID a new GUID. So you want to add that to your code, to that on-insert trigger. Now, when you're creating a page for your API, it is a page type of API. You might be familiar with page types: list, card, worksheet, document. This will be a list type of API. And you want to set the delayed insert to true and set the source table. And we'll look at the code. In a little bit. You want to use camel case for the naming for your fields. And there are, when you're creating your custom API, you want to add the properties API publisher, API group, entity name, entity set name. And these are used by the framework to find your APIs. You'll need to enter those. They'll be part of the URL. We have some, rules here as far as what they're allowed regarding the characters. Your API version, that is your version. So if you want to start out with 1.0, that's fine. If later you want to move to 2.0, that's fine. Microsoft is doing that themselves. They started out with version 1.0 in a lot of their APIs, and now they're at version 2.0. They will be used in the URL. Okay, there's an OData key field property. That's where you tell the system what field is going to be that ID field. So when you're creating a new record in your entity, it's going to automatically assign a new GUID. But if you're modifying one, you're going to need to know what that GUID is ahead of time. And that OData key field is going to be what the system uses in its URL to identify what that record is. So here's just a sample page of the properties. Now, in this example, I've named it Customer Relative API. I have noticed since then that Microsoft is naming their pages for their APIs. They're ending it with the word entity. So that's something to consider. So you got your caption, page type API, API publisher, API group, version, entity name. Entity name, camel case. It's a good idea to start it with a prefix that you would use when you're creating your custom fields or your custom tables. Ours is INVC. Customer relative, the entity set name should be a plural of that. And that's what is, when you view your APIs later, either in Postman or your apps, that's the entity set name that you'll see listed as the INV's customer relatives in this case, but the entity set name is what shows up as the API. So there's some Microsoft documentation on endpoints, and I'll leave the slideshow to show you that page. It's important to know that it's there. You can use it as a reference. It is something to remember. Your OAuth 2 is there's a mention in that on that page about OAuth 2, and they recommend that you use that for connecting to production. But they don't specify on that page that it can't be used for service to service. So if you're actually making an app that is reading information from a SQL database and you want to send that information over to Business Central or vice versa. So you've created your own app, it's working service to service. You don't want there to be any user intervention at all on having to authenticate. In that instance, you won't be able to use OAuth 2 for custom APIs or standard Microsoft APIs like items or customers. Service to service OAuth 2 authentication is available now in Business Central 17, the 2020 fall release, for automation APIs only. If you wanted to look up a list of the automation APIs, you can do that. You just Google Business Central automation APIs, and you can navigate to what's available to use for service to service with OAuth 2. But if you're just trying to read customers or read your custom APIs, you'll have to use basic authentication for service to service. All right, so let's leave the slideshow. Let's go to some pages here. So I did find this to be a good starting point. This is the Microsoft documentation, getting started developing Connect apps for Dynamics 365 Business Central. Again, it's saying you should use OAuth 2 for production. Please keep in mind what I just went over. Basic authentication is still supported and works well. I don't know if OAuth 2 is nice, but it does require user intervention, and we'll cover that when we're doing Postman. You need an initial logon. The user actually just have to log into the tenant. We will be going over Postman today, basic authentication, and OAuth 2. And if you don't want to create your own, if you don't want to register your own app in Azure Active Directory, I did find their information here on using their test app to be helpful, and it did work. Because I'll take you to the other page that will tell you what your URLs need to be. It is a little bit confusing, so I'll go over that. And the URLs that I'll be using today, I recommend is what you use as well. But I do want you to know the documentation is there. You will want to reference that if you are doing on-prem. Today I'm focusing mostly on cloud connections to the SaaS environments, but the URLs are similar, but you will want to reference this page when you're doing your on-prem, so you can get your initial base URL worked out. I'll go ahead and go there. So here are your URLs. It took me a while to find URL examples that actually worked well. This page itself got me so far, but you'll notice that it's not referencing tenant IDs on this page. It's saying environment name. For rapid development, it's saying user domain name. You don't need those. You're okay just using the tenant ID for both scenarios, for both production and rapid development. With OAuth 2, the token that you're using knows what tenant you're in, so they leave that out, I believe, on this page. But it's just easier, in my opinion, just keep your same URLs for both. You can use the same URLs for both basic authentication that you use for OAuth 2 authentication, and I just use tenant ID for all of them. You will see a reference here in this document saying environment can be named sandbox or production environment. That has changed since this documentation came out. You can name your sandboxes what you like: sandbox dev, sandbox test, and you can connect with those environment names. And further down on the page is when you'll see your URLs for Dynamics 365 Business Central on-prem. So they are different at the beginning. It's your base URLs, your port. You need to specify your server instance, but the rest you can make out what you'll need to change based on my examples today from SaaS. Need your API version for Microsoft standard APIs, and for your custom APIs, you'll still need your publisher, API group, API version, and then you finish it off with your entity name, your company IDs if needed. Okay, so let's talk about the endpoints that I believe you'll need to know. So there's a list of environments. Let's say you wanted to do some automation with your app and you wanted to modify more than one environment at a time. You wanted to iterate through a list of environments, production, sandbox, sandbox dev. This endpoint for your list of environments will get you there. You can use OAuth 2 for that, and you don't need a public token. You can use a confidential token. So that's something you won't need user intervention with. All right, the next URL is a list of native APIs. So that's how you can get the Microsoft standard APIs. And of course, the tenant ID is in there. It's not a real tenant ID. It comes after the version 2.0. Then there's tenant ID. Then there's the sandbox, which is the environment name, API version 1.0. Depending on what version of Business Central, that version number will come into play. List of custom APIs, and the URL is different. It will not list the Microsoft standard APIs when you use this URL. It will list the custom APIs that have been created for the API publisher you passed, API group, and an API version. Now, your list of companies. So let's say you wanted to make some automation apps that are going to modify the item table in multiple companies. And this will give you a list of what those companies are. Returned with that list will be a company ID. And you'll be using that to actually go in and modify your records. You'll need that company ID that's returned from this list of companies to access the specific customer table, for instance, in Cronus, USA. If you needed to modify Cronus Canada, you would need that company's ID. Now we can go into the actual call. So if you want to get a custom entity list, this URL isn't the same thing that you would use for a standard Microsoft API. You would reference that URL in that API documentation page. But we're focusing on the custom entities today because I believe that's what you'll be using most. If you look at the standard Microsoft entities that they've supplied, they won't have your custom fields. Most people will have custom fields added to their customer table, to their items, and you'll end up creating a custom API more than likely. So we'll focus on these URLs. Again, you need your tenant ID, your environment name, API publisher, group, API version. You'll need the company ID and your entity set name that you're trying to read. So this will give you a list of the records in that entity. The post uses that same URL. The get uses that URL, but it's modified a little because the get single record by ID. that is. So you can get a single record by passing in the ID for that record in your URL. So you'll notice at the end of my example here, I've got INVC customer relatives, and I've passed an ID. The patch and delete. Patch you would use to update a record. Delete you would use to remove a record. It's the same URL that you use for the get a single record by ID. You know, of course, you're just using patch or delete as your command. However, for those, and this wasn't available to me until I ran across it finally during my troubleshooting of why I couldn't update or delete anything. It's because you need to get that OData E tag from the JSON, from the return JSON when you're looking up your record. It's going to have it's not a GUID, it's like a serialized number. I'm not sure exactly what algorithm they use to create it, but it is a tag that they assign to a record. And what you do is you grab your record, you grab that key, and now you can update it or delete it. If someone else has made a call before you do that, or some other app has made a call and they use that same ID, that same E tag, and they've made the change before you do, when your app tries to modify it with that same E tag, the system will say another user has modified this record, or the page has already been updated. Please start your activity again, something to that effect. It uses that OData E tag to make sure that you're working with the most current record. So you need to grab that, and you need to put that in your header. And I'll show you where you'll be doing that. And then that last URL there is how teaches you how to filter your APIs. For instance, maybe you don't know what the record ID is that you're trying to modify, but you want to filter by name. So you can add a filter for name and grab that record ID and start using it. Okay, for OAuth 2 authentication, this was new to me when I was trying to figure out how to do these APIs. So this link here I found to be most helpful to me. I did have some trouble when I first started doing it, trying to understand what it was telling me, but it's really not that bad. The creating your app registration really isn't that hard. All right, so let's start going to those screens. Okay, we'll go to our VS Code here. Pretty much was pictured already. We'll go to our table. This is my customer relative table. It's associated with the customer table. It's just a demo table, but its basic premise is I want to list relatives for that customer. Maybe I'm working with families. Maybe all my customers are families and I want to list the relatives. So we've got a code field, which is my primary key, along with the customer number. So my primary key is code and customer number. I've got my on insert, assigning a new GUID to my ID field. And I have rename logic. This is something you want to keep in mind with your custom APIs. In the API, you're modifying based on the record ID, the ID field. So you're passing the ID in. And the API, I mean, along with that call, you could be passing in a different code and a different customer number, but yet than what was there before, but yet you passed in the record ID for a different code, a different customer number. Well, if you don't put some rename logic on your table, you can change those values, and perhaps you don't want to. You don't have to throw an error like I'm doing here, but you should add some type of logic, so you're able to, and you can do it at the page level. You can, I do have some at the page level, but you do want to keep that in mind. It's easy to change a primary key and maybe not know it. So keep that in mind. You got your on rename trigger, and I'll show you what we do at the page level too. Okay. The customer relatives page is just the page that you use in Business Central. It's what you bring up from Business Central. And I've created my API, which is a separate page, of course, page type API. And I've got my camel casing for my fields. And I've run across documentation saying that you should put a trigger for the on insert record on your page. That was before a certain version when the APIs weren't firing off business logic from your table, but they are now. So you don't need to do that anymore. I do have some logic here on my on modify record dealing with my rename. So I determine if it's a rename, and then I have it call my rename trigger on the table, and I have it throw the error. On delete trigger, same thing. There was some documentation I ran across, it might have been a year old. It's saying that you needed to have it on your page, and that's not the case anymore either. So as far as creating your API, it's pretty basic. You've got your customer table already created. You just go ahead and create your API page with the fields that you want exposed. Make sure it's camel case. Make sure you've got your on modify trigger filled out. And don't forget your properties up here about your OData key fields, pointing to the right field for your ID, and the rest filled out as well. Publisher, API group, version, entity name, entity set name. Let me go to the quick start to register an application with Microsoft Identity Platform. This is a great starting point if you don't know how to do it already, if you don't know how to register your app. Maybe you don't have permissions, you need to hand it off to your system admin. This is the page they should start at. It will go in more depth than what I'm going to do, but really you're just in there, you're ready to register an application. You click on a button, you keep the defaults that you see here in this documentation. You can add your redirect URI right away if you want to, or not, and then you're in app registrations, click on new registration, give it a name, keep the default for your supported account types, and scroll. Here's where you enter your URI. The URI is your redirect URI. I'll show you what Postman does with that. It's what you'll use in your console apps too. And click on register. And it creates your app for you. This was already created, but basically there's not much to this. Here's my application ID that was auto-generated. You're going to need this application ID. It's going to be the client ID that you'll see referenced in Postman. And also when you build your app to use the APIs, you'll be using this client ID to connect with OAuth 2. This isn't for basic authentication. This is for OAuth 2 authentication. If you want to modify your redirect URIs, you can click on the link here, or you can go to Authentication. It's the same place. You'll see that there's a web platform I have here. You can add more than one redirect URI. If I'm using Postman Online, which I am doing today, I'll be using this redirect URI in Postman because you can't modify it. They auto-generate it, and I have to use this one. When you're not using Postman Online and you have the app installed in your desktop, you can make up your own redirect URI. You just have to make sure that what you're using in Postman is what you have here in your registration. Not included in like some of the get started apps, or this gets in the get started documentation, is adding a mobile and desktop applications. If you want to go beyond Postman or apps like Postman, and you want to start using a console app, for instance, you're going to have to add the mobile and desktop application. So if you're going to add a platform, you can choose web, or you can choose mobile and desktop applications. Web will create by default, and mobile and desktop applications won't. So you can add that later, and when you do, it's going to create 3 redirect URIs automatically. I put a check mark on this first one, login.microsoftonline.com. If you don't set this up, you'll get errors when you try and use your console app. I'm trying to use OAuth 2. You know, if you're using OAuth 2 from your console app, because you're expecting a user to log on and interact with your app, you would add this mobile and desktop applications. And you leave the rest default. I didn't have to change anything else. Certificates and secrets, you are going to have to create a secret. I've already created one. If you need a new one, it's a new client secret. You just fill in your description, you tell it when it expires, and it will show up over here on the right. You'll see that mine has asterisks. That's because once you create your secret and you exit the environment and go back in, you can't see it anymore. So grab it after you create it. And then because you'll need that for your apps. You'll need that for Postman, you'll need that for your console app. There's not much left except for API permissions. In fact, that's it after API permissions. I didn't have to fill out anything else. And for your API permissions, you click on your add a permission and you select Dynamics 365 Business Central. This will get you your permissions necessary to reach the Dynamics 365 Business Central in the cloud. You click on delegated permissions, checkmark user impersonation. Again, if you're going to connect with a console app or some type of service app, application permissions. And you want to give it app access. And then your end should look like this. If you see like a warning sign saying something needs to be granted, you click on grant admin consent for ABC computers. I've already done that, so I've already granted these permissions. So your end result should, if you want to use console apps, your end result should look like this. If you just want to use Postman to do your testing, you don't need app access. You would just see user personalization. And there was nothing else that I did for this registration. I didn't have to add owners. Didn't have to add roles and administrators. I didn't have to modify the manifest. So let's get to Postman. So I've already published my extension that had my custom API. That's already in the system. And I've got my URLs here that we've gone over in the documentation. I've got my environments. And if I were to put in 2.0 in here, it won't work. And I'm going to show you a Postman bug that has recently popped up since last Thursday. Let's see if I'm able to replicate it, because if you were to use Postman right now and you were to use an already existing request, you won't be able to change your token for your OAuth. You should be able to, but there's a bug right now. You can't change the token currently. So I'm going to try to connect to this. And I've been denied because my token's expired. And here's where we should be able to go in and create our token. I'm going to try and create one now. So in the documentation, in the PowerPoint, we will be supplying the PowerPoint to you so you can reference it. You have the bearer here in your header prefix. You want to make sure that space is at the end of it, or else you'll be spending time wondering why things don't work. You give it a token name, grant type authorization code. If you're online using Postman, it's going to assign this callback URL for you, and that's what I had to paste into my app registration, or you can make it your own. The auth URL is the tenant ID. I'm currently using a variable in Postman. This would be your tenant ID that you see in your URL when you connect to your SaaS environment, whether it's production or sandbox. You're going to see that GUID for your tenant ID, and you want to grab that and use that in your authorization URL. And the token URL is the same as above, except use token instead of authorize. Client ID is that client ID that got generated in your app registration. So you grab that client ID, the client secret I've already grabbed and put here. These are global variables, this is why you can't see them right here. But this is where you put your information, your client ID, your client secret, and you don't need to worry about scope or state. We didn't define those in my app registration. You don't need to. But for client authentication, you do send client credentials and body. And then get new access token. So I've connected. I've previously logged in with the user, which is why you didn't see that the user, the Office 365 user window pop up asking me to log in. Now the users come into play here. I work for a partner, so I have access to all the customers that are assigned to me, but I'm not a user in all those tenants. I can log into many tenants and not have been a user in that actual tenant. I log in with my Inovia.com user, and I have permission. I can log in. I can view the environment. I can publish my extensions. I can assign permission sets, but I'm not an actual user in that environment. And even though I can create records, I will eventually run into restrictions. And one of them is the OAuth 2. So when you're working with OAuth 2, and even when you're doing basic authentication, just go ahead and create a user that's a user in that tenant. For instance, I am connecting to a tenant called Inovia-demo. It's a different domain than Inovia.com. It's Inovia-demo.com. And we had to create a user in that tenant, not a partner user, but an actual user in that tenant. They don't exist outside of that tenant, and assign that user permissions in Business Central. And let's go to that. So basically, you create your user. There is a web service key that you are going to need for basic authentication. And you click on the button for change web service key. Up pops a window. It notifies you're changing web service key, or should you want to continue. You click on yes. You say you don't want to have an expiration date, and it creates a web service key for you. And the only other step that you need to do is make sure you give them the right permission sets. Maybe they need to be a super user, maybe they just need restricted to modifying customers. That's up to your need. But you do want to create your user in that tenant and assign it a web service key. And so this user can be used for both basic authentication and also as the user to connect to OAuth 2. Let's get back to Postman. So here I grabbed my token. So my configuration was good. I've got my new access token, and now I'm ready to use this token on my existing request. I get the message access token added. I should be able to click on send and have this work. Let's look at my results. It's saying I've been denied. This is because the bug in Postman right now is you can't actually change the token that's assigned to an existing request. But what you can do for now, until I fix the bug, is duplicate your request. That creates a brand new request with the same properties you used before. My authorization is OAuth 2. I've created a token recently, so I can click on my available tokens and I can grab that token at the bottom of my list. You'll see that my token updated. And now I click on send and I've authenticated with OAuth 2 using Postman. So here's a list of my environments. I've got production demo, I've got sandbox dev. And let's talk about that URL. So again, this is your URL for grabbing your environments. That's in the PowerPoint presentation that we'll be supplying to you. The list of APIs, this is a list of the standard APIs. This is for OAuth, so again, I don't believe this is going to authenticate. I'm going to try it. And I can't do that, so I have to duplicate it. Create my new one. Go to my authorization, available tokens, grab the token that I recently created, and click on send. Now I've got my list of APIs. So these are the standard Microsoft APIs. I'm going to try and get rid of this window. Okay. Here's basic authentication. So here I am in the authorization tab. Instead of OAuth 2 for my type, I choose basic. And I just enter in a username. I've got a user in there in that tenant called API user, and I use the web services key assigned to that user. And that's it. There's no bug in Postman currently for basic auth. And now I've got my list of APIs that are available from Microsoft using basic authentication. So notice your URL. I've got my API Business Central, v2.0. My tenant ID, again, is that GUID that you see in your address bar when you're in your environment, when you're actually connected to the cloud. That's your tenant ID. And this one's currently pointed to production. That's the name of the environment, production. I can also connect to Sandbox. Let me connect with the basic auth so I don't have to change my token again. So here's my list of APIs in my sandbox environment. And you'll notice that I have some metadata here. So at the end of your URL, you can add $ metadata, and that will give you the actual metadata for your APIs. It'll tell you what fields are available, what data type they're expecting. So these URLs that I'm going through are the same URLs that we covered in the PowerPoint. And this one's for companies. So I can connect to my companies using OAuth or basic auth. Let's go ahead and skip the Postman Bug and just connect with basic auth. It's going to give me my list of companies, and you'll notice it gives me an ID. That's what I'm going to use in my next URLs. I'm going to need to know that ID to actually access data within that ID. Okay, so this next URL is going to be it's my custom entity. So it's going to be a list of INVC customer relatives. I'm using the company ID as a global variable currently. I've grabbed it already and I've stuck it in my Postman global variables, but it's the ID that comes from that list that we saw in the previous call. It'll be this ID here. You could replace the global variable with the same GUID if needed. So let's get my list of INVC customer relatives. So using basic auth, here's my list. And you'll notice the OData E tag. That is what is needed to modify your record, your OData E tag and your ID. You need to grab that OData E tag and use it in your headers. And let's go to that. Let's go to our post routine here. So let me copy that. I'll duplicate it. So I'll use OAuth for this. Go to my authorization, assign my current token. And for this, you worry about the body. I'm going to leave it the same customer number as my previous user, but I'm going to assign a new person. And here's my URL, my post URL. So I've got my tenant ID that you need to worry about. I've got my environment sandbox, API. This is Inovia Consulting is the publisher. Inovia customer is the API group. Version 3.0. These are the values that I put in the properties of my page, my API page and my extension. Company ID is the ID that I retrieved from my list of companies, and the INVC customer relatives is my entity name. So, looks like I've already created that record. So I did connect, and I hit the business logic. It tried to insert the record, but it already existed. The values that I gave it as the primary key already existed. Change those values, and now it returns to me what I've inserted. So my response is that API call returning an OData E tag, the new ID that got created, and the information that I passed to it. I'm going to grab this ID. I'm going to use it in my next API call for patch. This is what I'm going to use to update that record. And as I said before, I'm going to need to add a header. So you add an if match header, if dash match, and you put that O tag, I'm sorry, that OData tag as the header value. And you'll notice that this return is Postman returning some escape characters that really aren't part of your tag. So for Postman, you are going to want to remove those. Your format should actually look like this. Let's double check that. So W/quote, and then an end quote at the end of it. All right. So let's look at my body. I'm going to update the city and the county. Okay. So I successfully updated it. It returns to me a new tag. Got my ID, I've got my code, customer number, name, birth date. Here's my address, and here's my added city and county. I'm saying county because in Business Central, you'll look at the back end and state, the field name is actually county. Just wanted to, so I just kept that naming convention. Okay, so this is a new tag. This is not the previous one. I need to grab it because I'm going to use it to delete that record. Go grab my ID. So same URL as your get single record ID and your patch. Formats up here. Got my tenant ID and my URL. It's the environment name, API publisher, API group, version 3.0, my company ID, and I'm going to pass this specific record ID. So if everything is entered correctly, I should be able to click on send. And it successfully deleted, but you'll notice the status, 204, no content. The record doesn't exist, but it doesn't return back anything in the body. If I click on send again for that same OData tag and for that same GUID, I get resource not found. The record was actually removed. A little confusing that it doesn't send you back a response, but the record isn't there, so it's not sending anything back. So that's how to use these custom APIs using Postman. I've got a console app here where I'm using that same logic. And I do have the code listed in the PowerPoint. And we won't go into it. We won't go into a deep dive with it. But there's Microsoft Identity Client that you can get from NuGet. You're using the same URLs that we've gone over. Make sure you pass the right information. This is a call to get a public client token. That Microsoft Identity Client, this public client application builder method in that will return a token back to you that you can use public. So you need a user to log in and grab it. Basically, you'll get that prompt for your tenant login, and you can grab your token, and then you can start using your OAuth to for your other web calls. Here's code to get the confidential token. This is one where you don't need user intervention, but for what we're covered today, you will need to use, if you want to use OAuth 2, you need to use the public token. A user will have to log on. Otherwise, again, if you're using basic authentication, you bypass that. You don't need a user to log on. You've already passed it the credentials. This is the same. So in Postman, we did the get environments, returned a list of environments. This is the sample code that you can use to get that. I'm using the HTTP client. You'll notice the URL, same URL that we used before. Here's my way of getting companies using OAuth 2.0, just sample code here. You'll notice that I'm not using a tenant here. I'm not using a tenant in my URL. That's because the token knows what the tenant is. So if you're coding in C# and you're using OAuth 2.0, you can skip the tenant ID because the system will know what tenant that you're actually accessing. Here I'm using companies with basic auth. I am passing the tenant ID. It doesn't know what you're accessing. We're not using a token. We're using basic authentication, and we're passing our tenant ID. Here's our get custom entity using basic auth. I'm just using this as an if I pass in a customer relative ID, it grabs a single record. If I don't, then it gives me the full list. For this, I'm using REST Sharp, and you can get that from NuGet Manager. And I'm using Newtonsoft here, REST Sharp and Newtonsoft. Both you can get from NuGet Manager. And this, the Newtonsoft will help with your JSON, building your JSON that you're going to send. Here's some custom code for, sample code for post custom entity. So I'm going to post to the custom entity, the URL you'll recognize, we've gone over that, API publisher, group, version, company ID, API entity set name. You'll notice that the authorization, this is OAuth 2.0, so I'm sending my token, grabbing the token and I'm sending it over. Patch, I'm using basic auth. This is what updates the record. So I'm sending in my customer relative ID, I'm updating the information. And let me go to the actual console app and we'll run it. So there wasn't much beyond that. The sample code that you'll see in the PowerPoint presentation. You'll have access to that. Let's go ahead and just run it here and I'll explain to you the return. So here's my public token. Now this user is the user that's in the tenant. If I were to use the rbautorf at anovi.com, it's not going to work for me. It has to be user in the tenant. So I've grabbed the environments using a public token. I've grabbed the environments using let's wait for it to finish. Grab the environments using a confidential token. Here's my list of companies with the public token. The other one's a list of companies using basic auth. Posting with basic auth. I have some code in there. The information I'm passing already exists in the system, so the business logic runs and says this record already exists, basically, for both my basic auth and OAuth. Updating with basic auth, gives me back my return JSON. Deleting with basic auth, the ID that I happen to pass in this code, again, was one that was already removed. So I'm getting the business logic back telling me that resource not found for the segment, but it did connect and it tried to do what I passed it. And at the bottom, I'm getting my list of custom entities with basic authentication. Okay. So again, you're going to have access to this PowerPoint. I find that I guess what I'm offering most today is a library of everything that I had to find to get things working that you saw today. So the links on this last page here are kind of what I use as starting points. Some of it's old. That top one has more information. Maybe you're going to use a version that's a year old. Maybe you're connecting to an on-premise version that's a year old. Maybe this link will apply, but it was a good starting point for me on how to create my custom APIs. Using OAuth 2 to get tokens. That was also a starting point for me. That was the I used some of that code to grab the public token and the confidential token. And your API page here, it's a good starting point on just building your API pages. The OAuth 2 authorization for service-to-service calls for automation APIs. What I have here is a link to a blog. So that creating a service-to-service call using OAuth 2 for automation APIs wasn't available until this fall, until Business Central 2020 fall release. But again, it doesn't cover your standard APIs like items and customers or your custom entities. For that, you can't do service-to-service calls using OAuth 2. You'll have to use basic authentication. And if you need to know your on-premise server instance configuration and how to turn on that API, here's a link for you to do that. I'm going to go ahead and go to that page. I already have it open. So enabling APIs for on-premise. For SaaS, for the cloud, it's already going to be done. But here's some information how to do that. So it's not information how to set up your entire service tier. This is just how to turn on the APIs when you want to start using them. So, and about that, so these APIs don't show up in your web service page. When using web services for SOAP or OData, you would have to add the page or the code unit to your web services page. For these APIs, they automatically show up as an API. You can get a list of APIs when you connect to the environment using your external app. But if you don't enable access to the APIs on that OData services tab in your service tier, you won't see them. So they won't actually be available until you do that. And that's it for me. I will hand this over to Angie.
All right, Ross, thank you very much. We do have a couple of questions. Just as a reminder, the slide presentation will be sent out to all of you, so you will get all that information that Ross has on those slides so that you can check those links and data sources out. But someone asked, could there be an alternate way for you to send the link to the BC documentation? Is that possible? Ross?
I believe the question is referring to the links that I have in the PowerPoint. So when you publish this to YouTube, are you going to include the documentation there, Angie, for the Power App, or how can they download this PowerPoint?
I'm going to send them the PowerPoint
Okay.
in an email, so they will have that. And when we do post it, we will have a link for them to actually bring up the PowerPoint in a separate window. So
Okay.
the person just said, correct. I think it was all in the PowerPoint. So we're good on that one. And then where do we find the exact versions where the need for the table triggers in VS Code are needed and not needed?
I can't think off the top of my head where that would be, except in the with each version there's a what's new that you might be able to find online with your, either from the cumulative updates that you can get online, or if you go to the various versions, there's the what's new. Unfortunately, I don't know when that page trigger logic wasn't needed. But that's, if I needed to know, that's where I would start. I would suggest that for right now in your SaaS environment, the SaaS environments are updated to BC 17. You don't need it. You can do what I did today and have it work. You don't need to add your triggers for Business Central 17. I didn't need it for 16. There's I don't know when it changed. So that, I guess this, you can look in the what's new for the different versions.
Okay, and to add to that, we do have a cumulative updates posting on our website page. So I'll send that along with everyone, so that way you can be looking at those cumulative updates for your particular software that you are using, if that will be of any help. And then we'll also do a little bit of research on our end to see if maybe we can, find out exactly where to find that information as well, pertaining to what version you're currently using. And then we also had one more question. Does the Microsoft version number matter in the API URL? Can it be v1.0 or v2.0?
So that's also something that might change between your different versions. When I first started making my PowerPoint presentation, let me get to my URLs here. And when I was using Postman to connect, this end URL was version 1.0. So my version 2.0 at the beginning, for the version that I was on, I was told to use version 2.0. And my end version number here for the actual API versions was 1.0. And now, since 17 has come along, Business Central, fall 2020, they've updated their versions to 2.0. So that can come into play along with the version that you have installed. If you're on premise and you have an older BC version, maybe you're using BC 13, BC 14, you might find that 2.0 doesn't work in your version. This API environments, this URL that I have here that ends in version 1.0, this doesn't work currently in 17 if I make it 2.0. So this is only available if I use the 1.0. So it does matter. Again, depending on which environment you're using, maybe version 2.0 wasn't available for your version, either in the API for dynamics.com or this, where am I? Or or this end version number here that actually lists the different APIs that you can have. So both of these might have to be version 1.0 for your environment, or the first one will have to be 2.0 and the second will have to be version 1.0. So that's something to consider when you're trying to connect. If you're having older environments, you do want to think about that version number. And for the most current environments, you will be wanting to go ahead and use version 2.0 for both.
Okay, great. I think those are all the questions that we have for you today. I know we went over. I appreciate everyone staying on. It's a lot of valuable information. And like I said, I will be sending you the recording as well as the PowerPoint. And if anybody has any further questions for Ross, you can reach out to him. He's got his contact information up on the screen, or you can reach out to your account manager here at Innovia Consulting or our support team. And also, I want to let you guys know that we do have a training workshop that is coming up on December 16th. We just started doing some new virtual training workshops for people to attend. And this one is geared toward the introduction to Business Central development. This is a 3-day training workshop. So visit our website page at innovia.com/workshops for more information on this particular one and for our other ones for you to take a look at to see if you're interested in signing up for those. And we do have a few more webinars coming up next week. Next Tuesday morning, we have Amanda Ejiro from Innovia Consulting, and she's going to be presenting on Your Budgets Simplified with Business Central. And also on Tuesday in the afternoon, we have VersaPay ChargeLogic presenting on the death of the check and the future of B2B payments. So check out our website for more of our upcoming events, and that's innovia.com/events. Oh, have you heard our podcast yet? It's called the Innovia Conversation, and we just want to encourage you to listen to our selection that our hosts, Steve Waltz and Jeff Pergolski, have provided to us. And you can find out about all the different podcast platforms to listen to on our podcast page, and that's innovia.com/podcast. So check out our selection and subscribe so you'll be notified when those new episodes air. All right, everyone, we thank you again for attending our webinar. Thank you, Ross, for presenting, and we look forward to seeing you soon on another Innovia webinar. Have a great day, everyone.